Hello, comrades. Today we'll be discussing a topic which isn't talked about much in mainstream conversations. And when it is, it's usually talked about in bad faith or rooted in misinformation. And that topic is the difference between liberals and socialists. Yes, America, there is in fact a difference between the two. Before we can get into specifics about each ideology, we first have to define our terminology for this video. What exactly is liberalism? And what exactly is socialism? Now, something important to keep in mind here is that defining an ideology or philosophy is rarely, if ever, concrete. Different people throughout history have had different takes on these topics, influenced by their own experiences and pre-existing worldviews. Socialism, in particular, has had many different definitions and varieties associated with it, and even governments which have called themselves socialist or communist may or may not actually be either of those things in practice. There's no ideal place to start, so I'll just go ahead and begin with liberalism. According to the entry for liberalism for the online edition of Encyclopedia Britannica, liberalism is, quote, a political doctrine that takes protecting and enhancing the freedom of the individual to be the central problem of politics, unquote. Taking this definition at face value, basically what we're looking at is the role of government to promote individual freedom, though what freedom looks like isn't explicitly stated here. However, the entry goes on to say that, quote, according to modern liberalism, the chief task of government is to remove obstacles that prevent individuals from living freely or from fully realizing their potential. Such obstacles include poverty, disease, discrimination, and ignorance. The disagreement among liberals over whether government should promote individual freedom rather than merely protect it is reflected to some extent in the different prevailing conceptions of liberalism in the United States and Europe since the late 20th century. In the United States, liberalism is associated with the welfare state policies of the New Deal program of the Democratic administration of President Franklin D. Roosevelt, whereas in Europe it is more commonly associated with a commitment to limited government and laissez-faire economic policies, unquote. So already we can see that semantics are going to take up a huge role in this discussion. Policies that are called liberal in the USA might be labeled as social democratic in Europe, whereas so-called liberal ideas in Europe might be considered to be in line with American center-right political thought. That said, my primary audience for this video are folks in the USA, so for the sake of simplicity, I'm sticking with their definition of liberalism, which is usually in the center or left of center on the political spectrum. Now, let's talk about socialism. The definition of socialism, or communism, often depends on who you ask, and this is true even among self-proclaimed socialists and communists. But we can't deny that the words socialism and communism are, at least in Western politics, inexplicably tied to Karl Marx, who wrote the Communist Manifesto along with Friedrich Engels in 1848, in which they wrote, quote, "The history of all hitherto existing society is the history of class struggles," unquote. Their philosophy, which we know today as Marxism, went beyond government using its power to protect the poorest in society from starvation. Instead, Marx and Engels argued that this power should be seized and controlled by the working class via a, quote, "dictatorship of the proletariat," unquote, which would be achieved after a worldwide working class revolution. Marx went on to speculate that after a dictatorship of the proletariat was established, the government, or the state, would eventually, quote, "wither away," unquote, as the concept of private ownership of production and property was made irrelevant to society, at which point a true utopian communist society would be fully realized that gave, quote, "each individual the means of cultivating his gifts in all directions," unquote. And if you're sitting there thinking to yourself, really, that's socialism? That's not what I was taught at all. Trust me, you're not alone. And if you're watching this and you're a socialist but not a Marxist, don't worry. I'll get into other types of socialism in future videos. For the purpose of this video, though, we'll just stick with Marxism for now. Okay, so now that we have our basic definitions of liberalism and socialism, let's go ahead and compare them. First, we have this idea of freedom. 18th century writings on liberal philosophy, which is often known as classical liberalism, talks a lot about freedom, and it mainly coalesces into two ideas: freedom of the individual and freedom of the market. If you live in America and you identify politically as a so-called libertarian, these concepts will probably be familiar to you. The prevailing idea behind today's liberal philosophy in the USA is that everyone, regardless of gender, sexual orientation, race, religion, etc., has the freedom to pursue that ever-elusive American dream. And much of the legislation codified during and after the Civil Rights era has been aimed at protecting these ideals, while maintaining a capitalist economic system. Socialism, on the other hand, insists on freedom from oppression influenced by capitalism, and that an individual can only be free when all of his or her basic needs are met, and when he or she does work that benefits society as a whole, rather than a few wealthy elite. Marx and Engels wrote in the Communist Manifesto, quote, "The condition for the free development of each is the free development of all," unquote. They believed that capitalism encourages a fetishization of money at the cost of community welfare, natural and synthetic resources, and a sense of solidarity with society, leading to the infringement of people's rights and destruction of the environment in the name of personal profit. In the opinion of Marxists and other socialists, capitalism makes freedom impossible through alienation of workers from each other, and that working class possession of the means of production and democratization of the workplace lay the grounds for freedom from social and economic oppression. According to Encyclopedia Britannica, quote, freedom for Marx is largely a matter of overcoming necessity. Necessity compels people to labor so that they may survive, and only those who are free from this compulsion will be free to develop their talents and potential. The masters in slaveholding societies, the land-owning aristocracy in feudal times, and the bourgeoisie who control the wealth in capitalist societies have all enjoyed various degrees of freedom, but they have done so at the expense of the slaves, serfs, and industrial workers, or proletarians, who have provided the necessary labor, unquote. So it would seem that, on paper at least, both liberalism and socialism advocate for freedom. It essentially boils down to freedom of the individual versus freedom of the working class, or freedom of society. Though I'll admit that may be a gross oversimplification. The second factor in comparing liberalism and socialism is economic theory. This is where the differences become a little more stark, at least in my opinion. Now, I could take the easy way out here and simply state liberals are capitalists, socialists and communists aren't. But I'd be remiss in not going into a little more detail on this particular topic. As I mentioned earlier, on paper, socialists and modern liberals appear to agree on the idea of a society that takes care of its poorest and most vulnerable people. Basically, anyone who isn't wealthy, white, heterosexual, cisexual, a follower of Judeo-Christian faith, non-disabled, and more often than not, male. The liberal government's method of protecting its vulnerable populations is through state-administered social programs, aka the social safety net. This typically consists of monthly state-issued money checks, state-issued food vouchers, known as food stamps in the USA, employment programs, a public school system, and low-income housing subsidized by the government. All of this is taxpayer-funded. Now, in my view, there are two main problems with this method. First off, because these programs are government-run, their efficacy and availability often depends on who the public elects to run the government. Though it's worth noting that this is usually a problem unique to two-party systems. One party is usually against the existence of social programs, while the other usually supports them. So every time a general election rolls around, there's a legitimate fear among American liberals that a conservative administration could be elected and make budget cuts and tax cuts that impact these much-needed services for vulnerable populations. Secondly, the intended purpose behind this social safety net is to alleviate the financial burden of not being fit to work in a capitalist society, where money is necessary for people to survive. If there are enough jobs for everyone, And if the minimum hourly wage mandated by the government is high enough for a working person to live comfortably while working 40 hours a week, then the only people who will need to use these services are those who are literally unable to work through no fault of their own. However, if the minimum wage is not high enough for full-time workers to live comfortably or even survive, or if there are more people looking for work than what is needed by employers, they will have no choice but to apply for one or several of these social programs, which could potentially divert much-needed taxpayer funds away from individuals who simply cannot participate in the workforce. This situation can end up laying the groundwork for resentment and animosity between different sectors of the working class, diminishing any sense of solidarity. So, how does socialism view economics? Socialists, like many of today's American liberals, believe that all humans should be treated with dignity and respect and have unalienable rights. But unlike liberals, they also believe in implementing an economic system which reflects and encourages these ideals, and that capitalism inherently makes achieving them impossible. In his writings, Marx recognized that while capitalist economics helped to industrialize societies around the world, capitalism was ultimately only beneficial for the ruling class who owned these various industries, whom he and Engels called the bourgeoisie, and that the working class proletariat were essentially doomed to lives of never-ending labor, for which they would never reap the full rewards. Socialism's response to this is to call for an end to private ownership and control of the means of production, replaced by public ownership and control of the latter. This stems from the idea that cooperation, rather than isolation and competition, is the bedrock of a thriving society. Labor is generally performed to benefit the community rather than shareholders, and is democratically divided up between workers. Food, shelter, and healthcare are no longer bought and sold as commodities, so they are guaranteed for everyone, including those who are unable to work due to injury, disability, or old age. Wealth is evenly distributed amongst everyone, rather than concentrated in the hands of an elite few, and hoarding of resources is made moot. To clarify, the social safety net still exists here. The difference is that it is higher off the ground and wide and sturdy enough to bear the weight of all society, rather than existing as an alienating entity for the least of us. Another notable difference is how liberals and socialists each view electoral politics. But I think that's a topic which could be a separate video of its own. There's also the issue of imperialism, but again, I think that should be a video for another time. For now though, I hope that you found this video to be relaxing, informative, or both. I certainly don't claim to be an all-knowing expert on these topics, but I do enjoy learning about different political ideologies. And if you've watched this all the way to the end, I'm sure that you do too. I hope to get more videos made and uploaded soon, so if you liked this one, keep an eye out for more content from this channel. Until next time, comrades.